Welcome back. You're watching Richo. I'm Peter Vanelson, filling in for the man himself, and I'm now speaking live out of Melbourne. I'm speaking live to Josh Frydenberg, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Thanks for being there.
Nice to be with you, PVO.
See, you can avoid me all that you like, but you can't ever get away. All right, let's talk. I want to start on health. I spoke actually a little bit to Peter Dutton about this in the previous hour. The Prime Minister and the Health Minister have been describing the Plan B that is to be embarked on now in relation to the GP co-payment as a better policy outcome than the one that you all took into the budget in May. Can you just answer me this? How can that be the case? How can you do all that work to come up with a policy originally, but then consider this one better when it's what the crossbenchers, in a sense, forced you into?
I think it's better because it's a reflection of broader discussions with stakeholders, with the public, feedback from constituents to members of parliament. And a key element of this new proposal is its fairness, in that 8 million concession card holders, veterans, pensioners, people in retirement homes who are getting medical services there, and people under the age of 16 will all be exempt from this optional co-payment.
Which begs the question, Mr Frydenberg, why didn't you think of all of that in the first place? Why did you have to be dragged kicking and screaming over the line for what you admit yourself is a better policy?
Well, I think you see that across the board in a whole range of policy areas, Peter, that when you get some roadblocks, in this case in the Senate and from the Labor Party, further consultations can lead to a recalibration of the policy. And in this case, I think it is a better policy and it's a fairer policy. It's certainly going to reach the same end game, which is the savings which will be found over the forward estimates, and that money going into a medical research future fund. There's also the price signal that will be attached.
How believable
I'm very happy with that.
How believable do you think those figures are? I think it was $3.6 billion in savings before. Now it's $3.5 billion. That's only $100 million less. Yet the reduction in the GP co-payment has gone from 7 to 5. We have a situation where there's also all these exclusions that you've already taken us through. That sounds to me like the recalibrated mining tax, with the predictions of what it would raise when everyone looked at it and said, hang on, that doesn't pass the sniff test. And ultimately, of course, it didn't. What's different here?
Well, Peter, as you know, it's not just this optional co-payment, but it's also the changes to the rebates to move away from 6-minute medicine. And this two-tiered rebate system will be better for the patient because they'll get more time, and at the same time the doctors will be forced, I think, to change their business model somewhat to ensure
that's why
that
they're not happy about it. I think we can agree, yeah.
Yeah, but there's going to be obviously savings related to that. And look, I think Peter Dutton has done a very good job in a very difficult portfolio. Labor likes to run the line that we're ripping billions of dollars out of health, but in reality we've actually increased health spending by 40%, $5.3 billion over the forward estimates, and in the May budget we introduced a new 300 places for GP training positions. And so I think there's a good story to tell.
But you won't get any disagreement with me about that. The argument that there are cuts to the health budget, there are cuts to the size of the increase as opposed to actual real cuts. So on that score, people can argue the toss over other broken promises, ABC for example. We've had a bit of a discussion about that ourselves recently, but there are not cuts to the health budget. There are changes to policy and there are cuts to the size of the increase. But I'm interested in what you said earlier, Mr Frydenberg. You said that why this policy is better than the one that was taken into the budget is because of the level of stakeholder engagement. Shouldn't that have happened before the budget?
Well, I suppose there was a level of stakeholder engagement then, but there's even been more so.
You just weren't listening then, but you are now.
Well, I think this is a formal policy that was announced in the May budget, which therefore gave more people an opportunity, I suppose, to voice either their concerns or their comments. And that's the feedback that has come back to the party room and to the Prime Minister and to the Health Minister through backbenchers. And Peter Dutton has referred to that level of consultation with his colleagues too.
When are we going to find out what the details of this different paid parental leave scheme in fact are? The Prime Minister announced it on Sunday, but he didn't give us any meat on the bones of what the actual changes are in effect. Is there a timeline on that this side of Christmas?
Well, I would suggest it will be part of a broader package of measures tied into our response to the Productivity Commission's report into childcare, because, you know, there's no silver bullet here to make childcare affordable and more accessible and to keep more women in the workforce. It's a range of measures. It's tax changes, it's a genuine paid parental leave scheme, it's changes around childcare, and I think we'll see the government put together a suite of measures and release that in due course.
It looks, though, like the changes, as significant as they may be to the PPL scheme, as much as they may answer concerns in the Productivity Commission about the value of childcare as opposed to parental leave to some respects, and also obviously the means testing to deal with some of the stigma that Labor has tried to attack about this being a policy for millionaires, it isn't answering the key concern of your backbench. Now, you must know this. The backbench's concern about the PPL is the cost. The overall cost at a time of fiscal austerity. I realise that much of it, if not all of it, will be paid for by a tax on big companies, but that concern isn't being changed or answered because the quantum of money going into it isn't changing, is it?
Well, actually, I disagree with that, because if less people are going to be entitled to a generous paid parental leave scheme, then the overall cost of the budget will be different. Now, what the Prime Minister has indicated is that the levy on big business will still take place, but the money that is left over from the paid parental leave scheme that is taken in with this new form of revenue will now go into childcare, which I think is... Will there really
be money left over, though? I mean, I would have thought with company tax receipts going down in the wake of what we're hearing about consumer sentiment, the state of the global economy and so forth, I would have thought that, and particularly, I guess, commodity prices too, that'll just see company tax collapse, which might mean that you have less money, not more, in terms of leftovers.
Look, I think they're fair comments. So let's just see where we get to with my EFO and the Treasury's predictions, because obviously there has been a lot of downward pressure on company tax. I mean, just the 35% fall in the iron ore price since May is a $9 billion hit to our revenue projections over just the next couple of years. So you're right, there are serious implications to company tax receipts, but I'm confident that we'll get this policy right. I'm confident that people will feel that a genuine paid parental leave scheme with superannuation will become a workplace entitlement, and I'm confident that ultimately we'll get the numbers in the Senate.
I want to ask you a reflective question on the year rather than a combative one, if I can. It's an interesting one because you've had, as the Prime Minister describes it, a year of achievements, and frankly at one level I don't disagree with that. Stopping the boats, I might not like the method, but you've got to give credit where credit's due. That's what you said you'd do and you've done it. The carbon tax, same thing goes there, and the free trade agreements are not to be sneezed at because they have been in the pipeline for a long time and they've all been settled pretty well, and a lot of people have been surprised on the upside with what's been contained in them by the looks of it, for example, in relation to China. But at the same time as that, you've got a down-and-out situation in the polls. The Prime Minister is unpopular. There certainly is evidence afoot about internal tensions in some quarters, including amongst ministers, and you've got a situation where the PM himself is acknowledging his own problems communicating with the backbench, communicating with the electorate, and of course the barnacle removal process that follows. How do you weigh all of that up? The mixture of achievement and failure all in together. How do you walk away and sell it from here?
Well, I think in terms of our achievements, you're absolutely right. They have been some signature achievements, and you could add to that the $50 billion infrastructure spend. Finally, a decision's been taken on a second airport for Sydney after 50 years of indecision. In our own area of deregulation, we've met and surpassed our $1 billion a year target with $2 billion worth of savings. So I think we need to continue to talk about that, but when it comes to our forward work agenda, I think we need to narrow our focus, have clarity of message, and really play to our strengths. And our strengths are as an economic manager, because people do trust us.
The polls are suggesting that has gotten tighter, though. The latest poll, I think it was a Fairfax one, suggests that the traditional area of strength for the Liberal Party, economic management, has become almost a 50-50 contest. Now, I stand to be corrected, but I think there was only a 3-point difference between Labor and yourselves over who voters trust to manage the economy on that poll.
Well, I think, what you're starting to see there is voters reflect on that fairness argument that I referred to earlier. You never want to give that ground away to your opposition. You need to find savings. I mean, obviously we were left a very, very big budget deficit by those opposite, and we are now determined to rein in spending. Now, that requires some tough decisions. But if you can actually explain that to the people in the context of over the horizon, the legacy that is left to their children, the ongoing interest repayments on a ballooning government debt. If you can explain actually the merit of your proposals and the fact that the burden is being felt across the board with carve-outs for people who can't help themselves.
But is it really being felt across the board? We don't see changes in the superannuation space which significantly favours the wealthy. We don't see adjustments. I realise this is more state than federal politics, sure. But in terms of negative gearing, I mean, how fair truly is it? Well,
I think you saw us criticised for introducing that new temporary deficit levy of 2% on high income earners. I think people are feeling the pinch across the board. We're starting to see our various workplace agreements with parts of the public sector come in, and we're taking a very firm line, as we have with the Defence Forces.
But hang on, you're not going down IR reform in a major way. I mean, this is something that your own side of politics, in terms of the business community, are frustrated by, that they're not seeing the kind of legislative reform that might not be work choices, but could be some sort of, son of.
Well, the best thing we could do in terms of industrial relations is to see the reintroduction of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, because that produced a $6 billion annual productivity dividend for the Australian economy and came out of the Coal Royal Commission, which showed real lawlessness in that sector. So we are being obstructed there again in the Senate, and we need to put the focus back on those obstructionists, namely the Labor Party. We've also changed the right of entry.
Well, it's more than the Labor Party, though, Mr Frydenberg. It's also the crossbenchers, whom your
sure.
Prime Minister says did a bang-up job making your health policy all the better.
Well,
why are they wrong on that, but they're right on the other one?
Well, because on this issue of the ABCC, we've got a proven track record. This was an organisation that was making a real difference, and it was obviously repealed because the Labor Party had an ideological hatred of a cop on the beat when it came to our workplaces. When it comes to this issue of the Medicare co-payment, that was only now starting to take form. It hadn't been implemented. It's yet to be implemented. And so I think those policies were at different stages, Peter. All
right, you talk about, in terms of the economy, the burden of debt left by Labor. They would say that debt has blown out considerably under your watch. I'd like to get an answer to that, because it's not an unfair point. It's not an unfair point. Courtesy of former Treasurer Peter Costello and his Charter of Budget Honesty, we had figures that were delivered by the bureaucracy right ahead of the election to try to answer all of that. But the other thing I want to get an answer from you on, if I can, Josh Frydenberg, is you talk about the need to find spending restraint, but equally we're being told that there won't be any more of that in MyEFO because of the delicate state of the global economy as well as the national economy. How do you square that circle?
Well, it's always a balancing act, isn't it? I mean, there is downward pressure on oil prices, and Australia is going to become the largest LNG exporter in 2017. Iron ore is 1/5 of our exports, and as I said, there's been a 35% decrease there. So we've got to be very careful to maintain stability in our local economy and to ensure that consumer spending is maintained, so that nobody really, nobody gets too scared by what is transpiring.
But Labor said all of this. Labor told us all of this after the GFC, and they were mocked. They were mocked by your side of Parliament.
Oh, come on. After the GFC and until just, last year, they were sending, $900 cheques to dead people. They were investing money...
That's a cheap political point. You know that. I mean,
well,
you can criticise the $900 cheques, but that's the anomaly in the system.
I mean, you don't think a couple of $1 billion on pink bats was also an anomaly? You don't think the overpriced school halls were an anomaly? They wasted the best terms of trade in 140 years, Peter. And they wasted it because they didn't invest in productivity-linked infrastructure. They set Australia up for a whole lot of spending commitments that we are now trying to roll back because Australia doesn't have the money to meet those expenditures. So I think, what we need to do in MyEFO is really show the Australian people the state of the books, to show where we do need restraint in spending, where we have been impacted upon revenue. And if you ask me about Labor's budget legacy. Quite clearly, they took office in 2007 with no government debt. They've now left us with a debt leading up to $667 billion, an interest bill of $1 billion a month growing to $3 billion, and their last budget, which they promised to be $18 billion worth of deficits, has ended up at $48 billion. That's not a pretty good record for Labor to talk about.
All right, we're going to get two interesting opinions to follow you on this. The Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen, as well as the economist, Chris Richardson. Josh Frydenberg, Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, no less. Appreciate your time on Richo. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Peter. Good to be with you.
Stay with us here on the program. We'll take a short break. When we come back, as I say, the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen, joins me from Perth.